lecturer in Chinese Studies at Lancaster University. His research interests focuses on critical pedagogies for modern languages, Chinese middle-class masculinities, Chinese male beauty cultures, and happiness in Chinese populations. He is co-editor of the Transnational Asian Masculinities book series with Hong Kong University Press. His book-length publications include the co-authored Men and Masculinities in Contemporary China, published by Brill in 2013. He has also co-edited two other book volumes. One is Chinese Discourses on Happiness, and the other one, The Cosmopolitan Dream, Transnational Chinese Masculinities in the Global Age. Both were published by the Hong Kong University Press in 2018. In addition, he also edited volume Critical Pedagogies for Modern Languages Education, Criticality, Decolonization, and Social Justice, published by Bloomsbury in 2023. I think this keynote talk, this special lecture, is going to be a very interesting conversation between specialists like us, like you, who focus on Chinese language teaching or focus mostly on linguistics, language learning and teaching, and a specialist in cultural studies, particularly to do with gender theories and research. So Derek's talk is entitled Critical Gender Pedagogy in the Chinese Language Classroom. So let's welcome Derek.
Thank you very much, Wang Chen, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak today. I feel very humbled in front of you all, specialists in Chinese language education. This conference has been a fantastic learning experience for me. It's been so rich and stimulating, so I'm taking a lot away from it. It's great to be in Newcastle, my first time in Newcastle. Really enjoying the university, and thanks also to the Newcastle Confucius Institute for all their support and organizational prowess in getting this conference running so well. So I am a cultural specialist, and as you will have heard from the introduction, most of my publications have been around gender, but in the last 2 or 3 years, 3-4 years, I've been trying to open up a new stream of research in Chinese language education, where I bring my gender and cultural knowledge into the world that you inhabit, the world that you make, this world of Chinese language education and all the great research that you do. So I'm just trying to find a way of bringing these worlds together. I'm very aware that I'm not a mother tongue Chinese speaker, and I come from a pretty very typical British background. I'm also a male. I'm not a female, but as you might have guessed, and I talk a lot about gender, but I just state these positions because they give me certain privileges. It's true in a world which is still fairly Euro-American centric, and certainly the university world, and the publishing, the journals that come out of academia in English, mostly, and for the high status ones, and so on and so forth. So, but what I am keen to do is try to critically reflect on my position and the advantages it brings, and to see if there are any ways in which I can try to look beyond my immediate kind of environment that I've been brought up in and been trained in, and so on. So I think the decolonizing perspective is quite useful in that regard. Although decolonizing can be done well, it can be done badly, it can be done superficially, and so on. But one of the things I'm going to try to get at in this talk is looking at theory and the kinds of theories that we use to build our research and our arguments on. One of the things I became very dissatisfied with in recent years was always talking about my own research here, sort of falling back into using feminist theories that originated in European and American contexts, and then applying them in a kind of empirical fashion to the study of phenomena in China or in Chinese populations around the world. And this seemed to me a kind of classic Eurocentric privileging of theory. I talk about theory originating from the global north and then being applied elsewhere. And so I'm really trying in this talk to bring in alternatives to using, let's say, feminist theory. The goal remains the same for me, which is to have progress towards gender equality. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have to use feminist theory to get there. And can we use the Chinese language classroom? Can we use the language classroom as a place where we work towards social justice, where we work towards decolonizing aims, a place where we collaborate with our students to make the world a better place? So that's where I'm coming from in terms of my kind of aims here. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about my Chinese language journey, and I'm a bit nervous now because my teacher from 30 years ago is sitting in front of me. And Emma, you know who you are. And so if you have any problems with the way I characterize my Chinese education, we can have a discussion later. But I had what I would call a fairly traditional Chinese language education, which was mostly focused on a kind of philological kind of emphasis. Which by that I mean it was more about us learning Chinese characters and the etymologies behind them so that we could read Chinese texts, literature, philosophy, historical texts, often classical texts. And it was a fairly conventional emphasis on learning Chinese grammar and then translating from Chinese into English, because we were reading the great texts, we were translating into English. And there was less of a focus on communicative competence. So I would say we spent less time each week on things like oral skills and reading comprehensions and these kind of communicative listening skills, although our teachers were great. But most of the time we were going through the Chinese classics and working into English. So that's not communicative competence, though. The communicative model, as we know, of language education has been quite pervasive over the last few decades, notwithstanding the degree I did. I think it's changed now in that institution. Many institutions have moved towards communicative models. So there's much more emphasis now in assessment of students' communicative abilities. But one of the issues with the communicative model is that it holds one of the criticisms Claire Cramsh has written about how it holds up a model of a kind of native speaker, as the target to work towards. But and that's a native speaker who speaks a standard language, right? So in England, in Britain, it would be maybe received pronunciation if we take an extreme perspective on it. And it doesn't really take account of the different languages that exist around in a particular area of the world. We know China has many, many different languages in different parts of it, but you generally wouldn't get that idea from the Chinese language classroom, because we just teach Mandarin, but we don't really look at why we're doing that or talk about it anyway. There's little emphasis on a critical approach to language in the communicative model. It's about developing language competence. And because I'm trained as a critical scholar of cultural issues, I'm always looking for critical approaches where we just look. When I say critical approach, I mean we look at the power imbalance, the inequalities that exist in different aspects of society and indeed language, because plenty of sociolinguistic research on language shows that language isn't neutral. It does, as I was just saying, enforce or kind of privilege particular languages over others. And it often reflects the language that we teach in the language classroom often reflects the language policy of the cultures or societies that we are teaching about. So we teach Mandarin because Mandarin is the language that's been chosen as the common tongue in China, and Cantonese is marginalized, and Minnan Yu and Kejiahua and all these different types of languages from around Shanghainese and so on. They're not really mentioned very much. Why don't we talk about that? Why don't we're sending students out to different parts of China? Why don't we let them know more about the different languages that are spoken in China and the kind of language hierarchies that exist? Now, this is a situation that exists in every country. And there's often a stigmatization of non-standard speech or has been in languages education. If a student uses a dialect word or doesn't use a standard word, then that's wrong. So, but language can be used then to or the way we teach language can be used to reinforce a kind of national language policies, or we can challenge the way in which language hierarchies operate. So that's what I mean by a critical approach to language education. Now, I think sociolinguists talk about this, and I think probably there are some modules in language programs where students talk about this. There is in my institution, but it's taught in English, and it's taught across languages. And my suggestion is, as languages professionals, we should be tackling these questions in our classroom. So when we teach language, we shouldn't be ignoring language questions. We probably won't be able to teach them in Chinese necessarily, or unless till we get to the higher levels. And it doesn't mean that we have to all start teaching Cantonese or whatever, but at least we should talk about the background to the different languages that there are in Chinese-speaking populations. And there is research that backs up the importance of this. So critical literacy studies has shown that when we take a critical approach to language study, to learning more generally in the curriculum, it's beneficial to students' development, their cognitive development, their knowledge development. If we neglect critical questions that are intellectually engaging, then it doesn't help the students progress as quickly. And the four resources model that Freebody and Luke developed is evidence of this. And there's plenty of research that shows that final point there, that it shouldn't be missed out, that we should be training our students in the languages classroom to be critical text analysts. So when they look at text, it's not just about understanding what the text means. That's the first point, the semiotic code breakers, or relating it to their own background or how they might use the information in that text for their own social purposes. But as identifying the standpoints, the ideological ideologies that are inherent in any particular piece of language. Now, I mentioned theory at the beginning, and I'm very inspired by one theorist called Raewyn Connell, who has written on Southern theory. And what she tries to do is to take the idea of theory and say, let's have theory being developed across the world globally, and let's draw on theory from around the world. Let's not simply just look to use the theories that have been developed in the global north. So as I was setting out at the beginning of this talk, why do we, I question myself as somebody who wants to see progress towards gender equality and equality in other areas of life. Should I always be looking to Western origin feminist theory to help me make the arguments to do so? It's not the case that everybody who wants to work towards gender equality necessarily wants to call themselves a feminist. So are there ways in which we can look to other philosophical traditions, to other conceptual approaches that avoids this kind of universality of Western thought and Western worldviews? And there's been a lot of critique in the decolonizing literature of Western modernity and its apparent desire to impose its thought structures and so on across the globe. So I think we're probably all familiar with the usual characterization of Western industrial modernity being premised on this kind of Cartesian dualism that separates mind from body and humans from the environment. This is what's led to, or the argument goes, this is what's led to some of the environmental destruction that we've seen because there's been this kind of separation of humans from the environment, quite different from the way in which humans were conceptualized in Chinese philosophical traditions. And there's a lot of great writing on the Taoist ideas of humans being interconnected with nature. And if you look at the Shan Shui Hua, you can see that humans are just one tiny little speck in these, so this is this different relationship between people and nature in Western modern scientific kind of traditions and and those of China and other places around the world. What I'm not suggesting is that Western modernity or scientific development is all bad and we should throw it out into the garbage can. However, I do think it's worth us looking beyond Western origin ideas and see what wisdom and inspiration we can get from traditions elsewhere. There's great scholarly work being done on this across the world. Latin Americanist scholars have in particular been very strong in coming up with new ideas. And one of them is Arturo Escobar. And there was Mignolo, who I quoted earlier in the slides, and there's a lot of great thinking coming out of Latin America. Just one example, of course, there are lots of great ideas coming from other places as well. But the idea I'm going to pick out today is pluriversal thinking. So this is pluriversal thinking advocates that we should have a world where many worlds fit. So rather than having one world where we just have one theory or one approach, we use different approaches. So for example, instead of teaching languages only through communicative theory, why don't we also introduce some other ways of thinking about the way we teach language? So moving from the universal to the pluriversal. And the pluriversal is a pluralistic way of allowing different ideas from different traditions, from different places around the world to emerge and influence how the world tries to tackle difficult challenges, and can be inspiring to how we teach languages. I think that's my argument anyway. What is pluriversal thinking? Well, it's all about relationality and diversity. It emphasizes that humans are always connected and interdependent with each other and the world, the earth as a whole. This sounds very familiar if you've studied Taoist tradition or Confucian traditions. Relationality is at the heart of that. So there is a way in which I think pluriversal thinking lends itself to kind of pushing us towards looking at some of the great Chinese philosophical traditions and see what inspiration we can get from them. So this idea of pluriversality has also been taken up into literacy research. So Mia Perry at Glasgow University has pushed the idea that when we have literacies education, we must allow for more than one logic, more than one semiotic focus and terrain of functionality. So this is the pluriversal idea. We're not just wanting to come to the languages classroom, to the literacies classroom with one set of ideas. We should try to find a variety of diverse inspirations. And this kind of thinking, pluriversal thinking, is entering into the languages pedagogies research world. So there's a great example online. Critical Multilingualism Studies is an online journal. I think it's open access. You can just Google it and get into the articles there. Their recent special issue was on the pluriversal approach in languages education. So I'm not the originator of this idea. I'm just trying to see how we can take inspiration from it and think about it in the Chinese language classroom. So what are they trying to do in this special issue? Engage with pluriversal thought in relation to the dualisms, I just mentioned that, and the universals commonly associated with Spanish. So some of the examples of the articles, the topics that they look at, are there in the third point. So how do we teach Spanish in a non-colonial way? Spain had a big history of colonizing, of course. An article questioning the absence of accents in Spanish. So why is it always a kind of standard, Castilian sort of mainstream accent that is used in the Spanish language classroom? So this kind of approach makes you think, what sort of accents are permissible and not permissible when we teach? What sort of accents do we try to take on, and what do we allow our students to if we have students who speak Mandarin with a broad Cantonese accent, what do we think that's fine, or do we try to change it? The place of Black Spanish teachers and Black language pedagogies. So teachers coming from diverse personal backgrounds, quite often not very visible. And then what about non-binary Spanish language learners, and pronouns? As we all know, that's a thorny issue in language teaching, and things, queer theories, and troubling ideas such as cis heteronormativity. So there are all sorts of angles: gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, accent, and so on, that we can come to the pluriversal language classroom. So, pluriversal approach to Chinese world language education. Let's move beyond, in my arguments, move beyond the universal imposition of Euro-American theories. Let's keep the good ones, but also expand into drawing on historical indigenous Chinese ideas or ideas from elsewhere. And so we open up a space for more varied approaches in the Chinese language classroom. And in this way, if our goal is to try to do good things in the Chinese language classroom that can make the world a better place, we work with our students to do that. Let's try to do it in a way where we're not reinforcing colonial models of foreign language pedagogy or any kind of rigid view. And that quote at the bottom is from Alison Phipps. Some of you may know her, a really inspirational languages and intercultural education educator who's based in Glasgow. She talks about moving into different subjective, affective, creative, ritual spaces, the kind of language that we don't often associate with the language classroom. But these kind of ideas, I think, should be explored more. So what is the theory that I'm going to base my ideas on here? So I tried to use theories developed by people based in not in the Western world. So there's an academic called Shi Zhiyu, and he is based in Taipei, I think, and he contrasts Western rules-based relation with Chinese role-based relation from the perspective of political science. So I'm sorry I'm bringing in political scientists, but I found their ideas quite useful. His idea is that there is a difference between Western rules-based relations, which is where you kind of have an agreement with a whole group of people that the different parties sign up to, which he contrasts with a more bilateral and flexible relationship, which he calls the Chinese role-based relations. And these sort of Confucian role-based relations create fictive kinship relations. I think we're very familiar in Chinese culture with the family relationship being very central, and also metaphoric families being created in different kinds of organizations. You can have your ge or your xiongdi or your jiemei. They don't need to be your blood jiemei or xiongdi, but it's a kind of metaphoric relationship. There are also historically unequal relationships between husbands and wives in the Confucian system as well. And so that's something that, how do we deal with that? In the West, there were unequal relationships, and feminism comes along and it has its way of dealing with it. I'm just seeing if we can find other ways. There are problems with these different approaches. The Western rules-based approach often tries to impose a common set of principles upon people. Often we hear people talking about the global world order. But that is a kind of idea America often pushes, because it's based on a set of principles that America strongly influenced, which draw from liberal Christian backgrounds and don't necessarily take into account the diverse traditions around the world. But we, as I just mentioned just now, we know that Confucian role theory also gives us a problem, because that husband-wife relationship has not been viewed equally historically. So let's try to reimagine these theories. And I think if Western approaches or Western frameworks can become more diverse, that would be great. That's a decolonizing initiative. If Confucian approaches or Chinese cultural traditions can become more egalitarian, that would also be a win. Oops. So my aspiration is to develop a flexible and egalitarian critical gender pedagogy deriving from Chinese traditions that's equal, though. That's the, it has a kind of aim of moving towards gender equality. And as I said earlier, let's try to make the Chinese world language classroom a site for progressive approaches to gender and other issues. So we try to do this through a way of bringing in Chinese philosophical emphasis on balance and harmony. So we're all familiar with He as a key underpinning principle in much of Chinese tradition. And interestingly, I found that in the Latin American tradition that I was mentioning earlier, there is a big push at the moment to think about the idea of politics in the feminine. So it's about bringing women's voices, women's ideas into the discussion to try to balance the overemphasis that we've had on men and masculinities and masculinist governance and practices over the centuries in the past. So how can we do this in a way? How can we think about politics in the feminine in Chinese cultural and linguistic worlds? So I've gone for this idea of yin yang, and again, you'll be very familiar with this concept. I'm drawing, as I'll show you in the subsequent slides, from another scholar who brings yin yang in. But before we get to that other scholar, I just wanted to say something about the yin yang concept, and particularly draw your attention to Dong Zhongshu in the Han Dynasty, who really took the idea of yin and yang, which were originally describing natural phenomena, and turned them into a gendered phenomenon as well, so that men were associated with Tian and women with Di, and men with Yang and women with Yin, and that introduced a hierarchical dimension to it. And I think that was problematic, and so I don't think we should go back to that. I think we should be trying to find some egalitarian way forward. But I do think this idea of yin and yang, where particular, a body, this body of mine can be sometimes more yin, sometimes more yang. Actually, I'm a yang shu, according to Chinese medical diagnosis. Many people, when they touch my hands, they say, "Oh, your hands are so cold, you must be yang shu." Yang shu, eat more yang rou. So this is but so my body is not predominantly yang, apparently. My body is, but I have a male body. So anyway, yin and yang, it can move across bodies in different ways. And so I think what we've had is too much yang in the world. Yes, this is a bit of a fun slide maybe, but European colonial chauvinistic, patriarchal kind of invasions is too yang to me, and environmental destruction is excessive yang. Discrimination against women is too yang to me. I think we need a rebalancing. We need more yin to balance the overemphasis on yang in recent years. I'm probably running out of time, so have I got about 10 minutes or so left? Right, I should try to wrap up very quickly, and I've got some examples at the end. But this scholar, Qin Yaqing, he is based in Beijing. He's a very well-known political scientist, and he uses yin and yang to bring in a different kind of theory, a different approach to international relations that I think is still useful for us in how we can think through this. So he contrasts a kind of yin-yang approach with the Hegelian dialectics. Without going into any great detail, Hegelian dialectics which Marx used as well, of course, is that you have a thesis and a counter-thesis, and then they fight and conflict, and then a new synthesis emerges. But Qin Yaqing's idea is that with yin-yang, you don't have that idea of conflict and then something new. Instead, you have the idea of different elements that work together in a larger whole, and they're not completely separate from each other. So put it simply, the Hegelian idea is you've got this idea here, or this group of people here, and that group of people there, or that idea there. They're separate and they fight, working class against ruling class. But the yin-yang idea is that there's always a bit of yang in the yin and a bit of yin in the yang, and they're part of a larger whole. And he talks about this as a Zhongyong dialectics. So dialectics is Bianzhongfa. So this is a Zhongyong. You're looking to find the common ground. So the yin and the yang idea helps you to find this Zhongyong, this common ground. And it's a kind of co-evolution. It's not conflict, it's working together. I think this can help us, this idea can help us develop an alternative to maybe the feminist approach. We can think here also about Shi Zhiyu's idea of flexibility and bilateral relationships. There's another scholar, Li Chenyang, who's based in Singapore, who says that we can use yin and yang in a gender progressive way, in a way that we can still preserve some of the Confucian ideas like a nanyu yobie. There is difference, but it doesn't have to be an uneven difference. It can be an equal difference. And one thing I have to point out and apologize for, that these three Chinese theorists are all men, and I feel very guilty about quoting men, and I must try harder to diversify. So the idea is that we have a pluriversal both and. We can have both feminist approaches and a kind of Zhongyong middle ground approaches. And sometimes the feminist approach might be the right one, and it might just be that we need that kind of conflict and then a kind of revolutionary impulse to get to a different stage. But in other areas, we might need a more harmonious approach. So the pluriversal approach says both feminism, both kind of yin-yang, Zhongyong approaches can be used. We don't need to choose one over the other. I better get into the examples soon, so I don't think I need to go through that slide. So this is the summary slide, and then I'll give you some examples and see what you think about the examples. They're very much off the top of my head and maybe slightly kind of subjective. But we've got Hegelian dialectics on the one side, which is your two separate parties in the conflict trying to get to somewhere new, and then you've got the Zhongyong dialectics where you try to find some sort of harmony, an inclusive middle ground. So how does this fit in the Chinese language classroom, you might be wondering? So what I think we should be doing in the Chinese language classroom from the very start of a beginner's classroom is to talk about the words and the characters that we introduce in a critical fashion. And when I say critical fashion, I mean, let's talk about the way in which they sometimes privilege certain genders or other groups in society. Let's talk about the power imbalance. Let's not pretend that language is neutral, because the communicative approach pretends language is neutral, more or less. But we should not be pretending that. So if we think about the third person pronouns, how do we, now this 女的她 was introduced in the early 20th century. It didn't exist before then, but we don't teach it like that. When we have students come into the beginner classroom in Chinese, we just say, there's a 男的她 and a 女的她. But we never talk about the historical background, and we don't point out that the 男的她 doesn't actually have a nanzapang. There's no nan radical there. It's a person radical. So why are men represented by a person, but women have to have a new? They have to, sort of set aside there. Now, but we should talk about this, I think. And there's no right or wrong answer. What would a feminist approach look like? A feminist approach might say, let's get rid of the danrenpang, let's put in a nan, and let's make it equal, right? That would be a kind of, let's have a fight with the danrenpang, right? But the Zhongyong middle ground approach might be, this is just my own subjective meandering thoughts, but it could be, let's use the danrenpang. We used to use it throughout Chinese history, but let's make it egalitarian, right? Let's make it represent everybody, including men, women, non-binary, whatever identity you want to claim, you could use that person radical. That seems to be more inclusive to me. Do we talk about yin and yang as in the classroom in the first few weeks or the first few months of teaching Chinese? I think we should. Paul gave us a wonderful talk yesterday about teaching language through culture. Why don't we talk about these great cultural concepts from the start? And we could use the full form, the fantizi. If you look at the yin and yang there, you can see how they refer to the shady side of the hill and the sunny side, the bright side, and natural phenomena. Sometimes the shady side has a little sun, or the sunny side has a little shade. We can introduce this idea of yin and yang to our students, and even talk about how Dong Zhongshu turned it into some kind of rigid gender hierarchy, but we can push back against that. That's the critical egalitarian approach. This one here, I don't know what you're going to think about this. So, 修身齐家治国平天下, from the Daxue, I think, right? So this is a classic Confucian idea of cultivating oneself and setting the family into stability and society, and then the whole world. Typically, it's thought of as the man, right, who would cultivate themselves, the kind of leader of the family. So it seems a little bit male-centric and hierarchical. I suspect a feminist approach would say, let's get rid of this. We don't need it. It's kind of pre-modern, and it's traditional, and it's not egalitarian. But actually, to me, it sounds quite a good idea to have this kind of self-reflective self-cultivation, and think about how family and person and society and the world are related, are interdependent. That's what pluriversal thinking says. So why don't we try to retain this idea, but make it not so gendered? Maybe even we could get rid of the Tianxia. I feel the Tianxia is a bit sort of like an emperor and his Tianxia. So I have a slight reservation about that. So I've turned it Shijia. I know Shijia is a Western sort of concept, but I'm trying to be inclusive here. The Junzi, right? I've written about the Junzi before. So the Junzi was always, or not always, but almost always a man historically, right? But there's no reason why women can't be Junzi. I know many people would have that view now, but maybe we can, instead of rejecting the idea of Junzi, which I suspect feminist theory would, they'd say, let's get rid of this prehistoric idea. Let's hold on to it, because the Junzi ideal is actually something very valuable and interesting, and a great inspiring model, I think, from Chinese cultural history. But let's not limit it to just men. This one's controversial. Can I have another minute or two? Yeah, sorry, it's 1 more minute, right? So now, there may be great disagreement about this one, but Nyang, to be a man and to be called Nyang is, for many men, is something pretty. They don't want to be called Nyang, feminine. And I suspect that feminist theory would condemn this use of Nyang and say there's nothing wrong with Nyang. Now, that would be feminist theory. But I think if we go to Chinese, if we think from a Chinese cultural position, why is it a problem to be Nyang? It's only a problem for a man to be Nyang if we use Western standard of masculinity, right? The Western standard of masculinity says a man must be like a Nanzahan. That's how it translates into Chinese. But we have these characteristics of masculinity and femininity, which really were kind of classified in the late 19th century and linked to biology and so on. If you go back into pre-modern China, the idea of the Caizi, he was quite fragile and scholarly, and but he wasn't really considered feminine. It was okay to be a Caizi. So why isn't it okay for some men to be a little Nyang? We can have some men who are Nyang and some men who are not Nyang. What's the problem, right? So let's just be more inclusive. I got carried away here with Fuqin Toyang. I think we should rework Fuqin Toyang as Jiajiang Toyang, and have the whole family come together to talk with the Jiajiang about ask them why they did this, and then almost finished. Xianqi Liangwu. I am sure that the feminist theory would reject this, but why don't we think more inclusively? Because we can be Xian and we can be Liang. Let's just make it less gendered. So let's be a Xian, Iron. I don't need to be a woman or we can be any gender you like, and a Liang Jiajiang, right? So let's be more inclusive. And same idea with the Rujia Wulun. I thought Junzhen can become any gender. Fuzi can become Jiajiang Haizi, this relationship, and Fufu can become iron, and Xiongdi can just become Haizi. So let's make things more inclusive. Sorry I ran over. I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek, for this fascinating talk. I think it really moves our discussions from what's going on in our brain, what's going on in the lab, what's going on with the grammar, to the intersection between language, culture, and society. It's very, it strikes me deeply that the perspective here is quite different from most of the conversations we've had so far. It creates this dialogue between the East and the West, and the perspective from not only a culturalist, cultural experts, but also a non-native speaker, but also very interestingly, very what Derek told me just before his talk, a very explorative way of thinking and reimagining. Or maybe you have deconstructed gender first from the Western philosophical and epistemological traditions. Yeah. So all, I'd say, very thought-provoking. I'm sure there are lots of questions in the audience. So the floor is now open. Teacher first. Yeah.
Yes.
吴老师 teacher 我
So you can only say claim that I'm your teacher when you make a mistake in speaking Chinese. Anyway, that's a very interesting talk. Thank you so much. I really like the idea of inclusiveness. Thinking of how to teach Chinese from a whole new standpoint, that we should rethink gender, how we approach to gender-related terms and expressions. Do you think that we should only take this forward in terms of Chinese language teaching, or should we go completely revolutionarized with all kinds of language teaching, such as English? Because expressions showing gender inequality abounds in English. Just to name a few, we say, time and tide wait for no man, and 2 months ahead are better than one. So I just wonder what your take on that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lao Shi. And I should use English so I don't make any mistakes in my Chinese. I think the Western world needs help now. We were not in a great shape globally. We've got social conflict, political conflict, we've got environmental destruction. And it's clear that some of the models in the way in which we've been running the world have run their course. We've had some great development, and there's still great progress and ideas that can come from Western science and Western theories, including feminist theories, but we need inspiration from other traditions around the world now. So this is not about simply saying, let's use Chinese tradition in the Chinese language classroom. I think it's a really good point. It's about bringing these great Chinese traditions into Western discourses. But we need to think about how we can reposition them in a more progressive way. Where they have hierarchical elements, we need to think, how do we position them in progressive ways? And I know there are many people who don't want to touch the theory. There are many people in the West who don't want to update or reimagine Christian ideas. But, you know, I have the same approach to that. I think there's value in our cultural traditions, but we need to help them move with the times. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we have another question.
Hi, Derek. Thanks so much for your wonderful speech. And I think there are a lot of questions that I, as a person in social linguistics, can identify with. And that's why our field put forward some ideas like translanguaging, transpositioning, third space. And also at this conference, Professor Zhu Hua and I are going to talk about how we draw on different cultural interpretations of harmony to understand. Yeah, that's a coincidence. And to understand like cultural communication in transnational families. So you are really welcome to like have more discussions with us. But my question is that, don't you think sometimes it's quite difficult to put some critical approach in classroom teaching? For instance, you mentioned like the diversity of Chinese accents are very important, and it's worth letting our students to know that. But according to my knowledge, although I do identify with your idea, the most Chinese ordinary people or the public, they have some stereotypes against the accents. Like they do think people who speak Chinese with accent are less educated or etc. So I think like some critical ideas might be quite progressive for Chinese learners, or maybe it's not that good for them to understand that at the beginning stage of learning this language. So I really want to hear more opinions from you. Thank you.
Thanks. So it's a really important question. We want to try to help our learners just become aware of the contexts in which different types of speech are effective and appropriate. And if I'm getting into a taxi in Shanghai, the type of language or type of accent or the words that I use, the tone that I use will be different from the language and the vocabulary and the tone that I use if I'm interviewing for a job in a Beijing top level technology firm or something like that. So I think our students need to become more sensitized to what kind of language is appropriate in which place. If I take a very kind of proper Beijing accent Chinese, and I try to use it in a very informal coffee shop in a small town in Hunan, it might not even be beneficial for me. People might think, who is this guy trying to speak in this kind of Beijing accent coming down to Hunan and this kind, I'm Scottish and I'm very aware of sensitivities about different accents from different places in Britain and how that affects people. So I think it's about helping our students to understand the appropriate use. So the standard language, when is it best to use that to your advantage? And then be aware of the non-standard forms and don't look down on them, but think about how you can utilize them in different contexts to your advantage. That would be my suggestion.
Okay. Well, because of the time, sorry, Derek, there must be loads of thinking going on at least, and more questions can be asked later in the tea break. So thank you again, Derek, for this wonderful talk. So now I'm going to hand over to Zheng Laoshi, who is going to chair the next guest talk.
Thank you, 王老师。好 ，Yeah，OK， 好，大家下午辛苦了啊！ 我知道这个当学生或者是当这个听众，要远远比自己讲课更累了啊，因为我也有切身的体会。接下来的环节，我请我们我的同事，来自厦门大学国际中文教育学院以及海外教育学院的副院长潘超新教授，来给我们分享我们厦大的国际中文教育的一些经验。好，稍微做个准备，
你稍等一下。
潘超新教授现在正在。